Hi, I'm Kat, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about Sabella Maclean and Scottish Lover. If you have any questions for me throughout the presentation, please drop them in the chat and I will answer those at the end. Poor Sib tends to see herself forced into the shadows in many of the published works about Anne, but she was a strong influence in Anne's life from 1820 to 1830 and beyond. Similarly to Anne's other lovers, most of what we know about Sabella comes from Anne Lister's journals, but there is a wealth of information from Sabella herself. 31 letters sent by Sabella to Anne survive in the Esholt Hall collection at the Colldale Archive, and another 22 from Anne to Sabella. These 22 are likely letters returned to Anne after Sabella's death per Sabella's wishes. There are also letters from Sabella and the wider McLean family to be found elsewhere, and it's important to take note of other collections, such as the papers of the Campbell family of Barcaldine and the McLean of Lochbuie papers. Large private collections of McLean papers exist also, some of which have been used to write texts such as Nicholas McLean Bristol's From Clan to Regiment, which features 50 years of research and 600 years of history, in which little about Sib and her family may be discovered. Quite a large book. It weighs about 1.7 kilos. Speaking of letters from Sibbella Maclean, this quote here containing the phrase "your friend Sib," the title of today's session, is from 23rd November 1828. Here, Sabella is writing to Anne from London after a period of biliousness following treatments under Mr. Long, the quack doctor, who we will look at in more detail later. At this time, Sabella was waiting for Anne in London so the pair could travel to Paris together for the winter. And whilst Anne was tied up at Shibden with repairs and building works, not that that stopped her making visits to both Tib and Mariana, she was not the greatest correspondent. Sib does open one letter to Anne with the line, "Why are you not writing?" and later makes a dig stating that "I am a much better correspondent than you." Anne's concern for Sib's health does, however, remain and is a continued source of anxiety for her, right from their first visits in York to the end of Sabella's life. So, to begin, who were the McLeans of Coll? The McLeans of Coll are a hereditary branch of the Clan McLean, a Highland Scottish clan. You might remember the map that David Glover shared yesterday. The clan is made up of several branches, including the McLeans of Duart, the clan chiefs, the McLeans of Ardgour, and the McLeans of Torloisk. All names I am sure sound much better pronounced in a Highland Scottish accent. The spelling of McLean isn't important and can be spelt in numerous different ways. They are all part of the McLean clan. The McLeans of Coll owned extensive lands in the Hebridean Isles, and this map labels locations with significance to the McLeans of Coll, particularly during the time of Anne and Sabella's romance. Sabella's father was the 14th Laird of Coll, Laird meaning landlord or proprietor, having succeeded his father Hugh, 13th of Coll. You will note that there are lots of Hughs in this presentation, similarly to Donalds and Allens. Alexander had been a student of law before the death of his older brother Donald, who drowned before he could inherit the land and the lairdship. Anne wrote to Sabella following their tour of Scotland to confirm the extent of the McLean estate, and the quote here is Sabella's reply to that query. In Coll, there are 11,000 acres. Remember, they are all Scotch acres. Rum, 22,000. In Isle of Muck, 1,000. Quainish, 6,000. Aros 9,000, Penmore 2,000. This is all the Coll property. When Anne first met Sabella in the February of 1820, the McLeans were resident at New Breacha Castle on the Isle of Coll, seen here to the northwest of Mull. And they remained here into the early 1820s before relocating permanently to the Isle of Mull. The new castle at Breacha was built in 1750 and neighbours the old Breacha, a 15th century tower house. Both properties are still standing today. The new castle is a holiday property and the old castle a private residence. Also on Coll, we can see Crossapole, the location of the McLean burial vault. The vault was built by Sabella's father Alexander on the death of her mother Catherine, who died in Bristol in 1802, presumably of consumption. She had been ill for many years before her death, and there are similarities between both her case and Sabella's. Catherine died at the age of 46, the age Sabella thought she would and did sadly die. It wouldn't surprise me if the manner of death and Sabella's own ill health was the reason she thought this. Rumour has it Catherine's body was stored in a packing case in the harbour for a full 12 months, whilst the mausoleum at Esholt Hall was built, and the previously buried McLeans were moved into it. The McLean mausoleum contained a memorial inscription to Catherine, which was transcribed in the book A Farmer's Year by Henry Rider Haggard in the late 19th century. Already in a poor state, the memorial has since been struck by lightning, rendering it illegible. To the very north of this image, you will see the Isle of Skye. And whilst not a McLean property, it does still bear some importance. Sabella's sister Katharina married Donald MacLeod VI of Talisker from the Isle of Skye. You will also see Egg, Rum and Muck. All of these are hereditary lands of the McLean family, the buying back of which in the early 1800s/1810s landed the family in great debt. Lastly, moving over to Mull and starting with Quainish, also confusingly referred to as Coll House, which I am pretty sure was at least partly down to Anne Lister herself, to make the sending of correspondence to the family that little bit easier. The name must have stuck, however, as in newspaper obituaries for Sabella's father in 1835, both Coll House and Quainish are used interchangeably. This is where the family resided on Mull, and the address can be seen used in letters from Breadalbane to Anne in the 1830s. Next, we have Drumfin or Dreamfin, located just outside of Tobermory. This was the house built by Sabella's brother Hugh, again another Hugh, in the 1820s, built partly with money from his second wife's family. Hugh's second wife, Jane, was sister to John and William Parish Robertson, who made their fortune in colonizing parts of Argentina in South America before becoming bankrupt. The house never quite reached its full potential. The costs, coupled with Jane's extravagance, meant there wasn't enough money to pay for it. The house was sold in 1856 with the rest of the McLean estates to the Stuart family. It then became Aros House, not to be confused with Aros or Aros Castle on the island, and it's now Aros Park. The house, however, is no longer standing. So that's the land. Now, who were the people? As previously mentioned, Sabella's father Alexander was the 14th Laird of Coll. He married Catherine Cameron of Glendessery, who was from Lochaline on the Scottish mainland, seen labelled on the previous map. Together they had 10 children, 7 of whom are listed on this family tree. The other 3 children, Hector Allen, Alan Donald and Isabella Jean, were baptised, but presumably died in infancy or early childhood, as there is no record for them beyond that initial baptism. The names of 9 of the children, minus Breadalbane, who was presumably born following the creation of this record, are listed alongside a date of baptism in the Coll Kirk Minutes. Kirk Minutes being Act Books or the record of proceedings of the session for a church court. The eldest child, Janet, or Jessie as she was known, married George Vere Hobart in April 1802, before going with him to Grenada, where he was governor of the island. He died in the December of yellow fever before the birth of baby Vere in the January of 1803. You will of course know Vere as the future and failed conquest of Anne Lister. Vere is first introduced in Anne's journal in 1822, where she is mentioned as being under the care of Hector McLean, Sabella's uncle, who can be seen here. Hector later lived in London following his retirement from the East India Company, and sometimes crops up in Anne's journal in 1828 and 29. Janet died in April 1804 of a pulmonary complaint, which may have also been consumption. Hugh, the only surviving male child of Alexander and Catherine, was born in 1782, possibly in Aberdeen, where the McLeans owned a large house. He first married Janet Baird Dennistoun, and the pair had 4 daughters, who entered Sabella's care on the death of their grandmother in 1822, their mother having already died in 1819. These children are often referred to as Sabella's children. In fact, Anne refers to them very pointedly as your children in a letter to Sabella in 1824 or 25. Hugh inherited the lairdship, becoming 15th of Coll, and was unfortunately the last McLean laird of Coll, the lairdship passing to the Stuart family on the purchase of those McLean estates in 1856. Hugh died in 1862 in Dunbartonshire, but sadly no one knows where he is buried. Then we have Sibbella, and following Sibbella is Katharina. She left for Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, in the early 1820s, after her husband had apparently outlived his fortune. Maria married Alexander Hunter, residing in Edinburgh, and Marion married George Lloyd of York. She died in 1821, only 6 months after her marriage, but the cause of her death is unknown. Breadalbane, the youngest child, lived to the grand age of 94. She never married, but is buried alongside her lady's maid turned companion, Elizabeth Metche, in London's Kensal Green Cemetery. The McLean family tree is particularly interesting, and many historical figures can be found here, mostly through Janet's marriage to George Vere Hobart. This family tree includes Victorian photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, Virginia Woolf, Vita Sackville West, and Scottish physician, anatomist, and medical educator Alexander Monroe. You may also connect more of Anne's lovers to this tree, including Tib, Anne Walker, and Mariana. Tib is connected to this tree through the Ray family, ancestors of Old Lady Stuart, whose mother, Anne Casey, was the illegitimate daughter of Sir Cecil Ray. Anne Walker has a more direct connection through Sibella's sister Marion's marriage to George Lloyd. George's sister Marianne married John Priestley of Thorpe House, Anne Walker's cousin. The death of their son John at a mere 11 weeks is mentioned within Anne Lister's journal. And lastly, Mariana through her connection to the Priestleys of Hall End. Oh, and there is also one last McLean family tree fact, and this one might be my favourite and shows just how small the world was then, and perhaps even still is now. Daughter of Catherine McLean and Donald MacLeod, Janetta, also called Jessie, married Charles William Marsh, nephew of Anne's friend and Mr. Duffin's second wife, Miss Marsh. They married in New South Wales. Now on to Sabella. The third child, Sabella, was born in 1784, but there is question over her exact date of birth. A baptism of the 20th of June 1784 is noted within the previously mentioned Coll Kirk minutes, but she herself believed her birthday to be the 21st of June. There was also contention as to her year of birth, Sabella believing herself to be a year older than she was. At Esholt in 1824, she tells Anne that she believes she is 40, when at the time she would have been 39, probably. When looking at historical records detailing birth and baptism dates, it's important to remember that church records of baptisms differ from parish to parish and often over time. Some record a date of birth, others a date of baptism, and some include both. The index, however, as might be seen on ancestry sites, often provides no indication as to whether an entry is a birth or a baptism, just to make things that little bit extra difficult. This slide, as you can see, features an image of a miniature of Sibbella Maclean painted by Alexander Galloway in 1807. Galloway was painting in a realistic style at this time, and so if Sabella were to walk into the room right now, she would be instantly recognisable. By 1807, the year this miniature was painted, Sabella had lost both her mother and her sister, and it is quite possible her younger siblings were in her care at this time. Breadalbane would still have only been about 14. According to Sabella, Vere would have also been in her care at this time, and it is possible that these commitments and responsibilities she is alluding to in this quote. Many I have found different from what I had at first judged them to be, but I never had time to search for friendships so much occupied from early life in domestic concerns. There are 3 known artworks of Sibbella Maclean: the miniature on the previous slide, this silhouette created in 1826 and included as part of a letter to Anne Lister, and a 3rd piece. The 3rd piece was painted for Vere Hobart in 1822. The artist of this 3rd piece is unknown, but we do know that Sabella had family, mostly in-laws through her brother's marriage to Janet Baird Dennistoun, and friends painted by famous Scottish artists Henry Raeburn and John Watson Gordon, and neither of these are out of the realms of possibility. And just because it grinds my gears a little bit, spelling of names is particularly important, and there is clear evidence of Sabella's name being spelt with 2 B's rather than the more commonplace single B, as seen in her goddaughter Sabella Greaves and Vere Hobart's daughter Sibbella Matilda. Sabella can be seen spelt this way in correspondence between Anne Lister and Vere Hobart, and Anne and Sabella's sister Breadalbane. The footplate from Sabella's coffin also displays the name with 2 B's, and that can be seen in Sabella's profile over at Packed With. So, Sibbella Maclean and Anne Lister. Sabella and Anne met at a rout party at the McLean's residence on York's Coney Street on 15th of February 1820, and Anne recounts their initial encounter in a letter to Sabella in 1824. "Bless me, who's that? She's an elegant-looking creature. Perhaps I was a little surprised and mortified and shamed at Mrs. Lawton's significant smile as she wondered at the question and answered, 'Miss McLean.' 'Come, come,' said I, after we have taken a turn or two up and down the room. 'You have seen Miss McLean several times. Take me up to her. You know I am blind as a beetle. Let me see her a little nearer.'" Sabella began a correspondence with Anne in January 1822, this first letter containing an update on her failing health. She had just begun taking mercury. Their correspondence continued throughout their friendship until Sabella's untimely death in 1830. They exchanged upwards of 200 letters in this 8-year period. The romantic relationship between Sabella and Anne is one that differs significantly from Anne's relationships with other women, in that it is a relationship primarily gained and maintained by pen, and their relationship is, for the most part, easy to follow due to its documentation and the preservation of the correspondence exchanged. It is, however, important to remember the biases of Anne Lister's personal accounts and the one-sided nature of much of this correspondence. Where Sibbella Maclean's letters survive, Anne's half of the conversation is lost, and vice versa. There is little overlap in their surviving correspondence, thus leaving us reliant on limited excerpts noted in Anne Lister's journal. This can create biases in our understanding of Anne and Sabella's friendship, and it is perhaps easy to assume that the relationship between the pair was one-sided. Reducing this relationship to simple friendship, however, is a disservice and fails to recognise the complexities of this companionship. It may be a relationship primarily gained and maintained through written correspondence, but that does not reduce its intensity. It is still intimate, and its lack of physical connection doesn't make it less so. She might not have been meeting with Sib regularly or engaging in sexual activity, but that doesn't diminish its importance. The pair did, however, shag their way around Scotland. Sabella wasn't naive. She understood what Anne wanted. She was also explicit in her own feelings toward Anne, which we can see from Anne's letter extracts. "My thoughts incessantly wandered to you. I longed to be settled in quietness with you, and at your elbow from morning till night. Did you not say so?" Whilst Sabella and Anne corresponded regularly, exchanging letters each month and more frequently in later years, the pair met infrequently. Despite a desire to see one another, travel, illness, and responsibility to close family often put plans on hold. Following Sabella's departure from York and return to Scotland in April 1822, she and Anne would not meet again until a whirlwind visit to Esholt Hall in May 1824. Esholt Hall was the country seat of the Crompton family. Anne had had a brief flirtation with Henrietta Crompton in 1823. Her invitation to Esholt, sent by Henrietta, had surprised Anne, she fancying her friend Sib in Paris, and she sent a servant to overtake her aunt in the carriage in Halifax so she could take it with her. This too-brief meeting at Esholt became a milestone in the romantic friendship that had begun to blossom between Sabella and Anne within the pages of their letters. This brief encounter fanned the embers of affection and regard to a flame that would burn on for another 4 years of failed plans to meet and longing love letters. Anne remarked on returning home, "I seemed waking from a dream." During their time at Esholt, Anne and Sabella took the gig to Otley. Whilst there, Anne bought a watch riband and horses were ordered for the McLean's return to Scotland the following morning. In walking the road back to Esholt, Anne laid open my character as entirely as possible. As I went along, I by degrees expressed myself in terms of regard. Not to perhaps be mistaken, said she and Mariana were the only 2 people I had ever seen with whom I could live happily. I left as if I could give therein to either and love and be happy with that whom circumstances put within my reach. Certainly did not deny that she could live happily with me. She thought me very odd, but certainly neither found fault nor seemed displeased with my oddity. On this drive, Anne told Sabella about Mariana and her marriage to Charles Lawton. Mentioned my first acquaintance with Mariana, the blue silk handkerchief introduction. We had both strong prejudice against each other. Her friends were afraid I should oppose any opportunity she might have of marrying well. My friends did not like the connection or like my knowing anything of the family. Her marriage was a serious business to me, yet I never mentioned nor opposed it. Would I have done, though it had cost me my life. Esholt is the first time Anne and Sabella become physically intimate, Anne endeavouring to kiss her neck and chest, as far as her buttoned nightgown would allow. This appeared to startle Sabella, and the pair were definitely embarrassed in each other's company later that morning. Esholt is mentioned, referenced, and considered by both women in their correspondence during the time between their departure at Esholt and their being reconnected at Edinburgh in May 1828. And just a little Esholt tidbit, it must have been here that Sabella mentioned the treadmill at Coldbathfields prison that she had seen on her journey to Esholt from Cheltenham through London. This is the prison treadmill that Anne would later make the newspaper for requesting to see herself, inspired by Sabella's own visit. Might get one any time from 11 to 3 tomorrow. I am determined to see this, not only for its own sake, but the treadmill was the only thing Miss McLean saw when in London this year. Anne was reunited with Sabella at Edinburgh on the 19th of May 1828, 4 years after their last meeting at Esholt. There were several hopes at meeting between these two dates, but sadly none of these came to fruition. The opportunity to visit Quainish with the Norcliffes in 1824 was lost when Anne decided to visit Paris instead. And we all know what happened there, although Anne was very adamant that Sabella needn't feel jealous of Mrs. Barlow. An invitation to Anne to visit Sib at Quainish in 1825 was turned down by Anne herself when she had to take her aunt to Buxton. An 1826 reunion dashed by the death of Anne's uncle, and several other opportunities lost to Sabella's caring for her own ageing father, who in the end outlived her by 5 years and died at the age of 83. It is on this trip that Anne tells Sabella about Eliza Rain and their plans together, about Madame de Husney and their absolutely filthy stories, and of her plans to have Mariana live with her should Charles die. Perhaps I have insinuated too strongly M's living with me, but after all, Miss McLean's old maidishness bears it very well. Mariana's living with Anne is a regular topic of conversation for Anne during their time together. In fact, it comes up for the first time a mere 2 days into their 2-month trip, and it is no wonder Sibbella was a little bit pissed off with her. It is also during this trip that they became physically intimate with one another, and it's important to note Sabella's initial reluctance towards this connection at first. Scotland sees a change in the dynamic of Anne and Sabella's relationship. Whilst it had previously been Anne in love with Sabella, Scotland sees Sabella truly falling for Anne, stating that she was as good as a married woman, not an old maid. Their affection toward one another had been perceived by others, and Sabella is referred to on at least one occasion as Anne's mistress. Scotland really is a goldmine of crypt-hand passages regarding Anne and Sabella's relationship, if you can get through the many, many iterations of Very Fine Bridge. The constant talk of Mariana and Anne's commitment toward her would eventually cause upset for Anne in London in the spring of 1829, when on meeting again, the pair argue. Sabella accuses Anne of not speaking like an engaged person at Esholt, and they have what Anne describes as a regular scene. She said, "How could she understand me?" And I said, "How could she help understand me? It was possible for me to venture further with her heart would have understood me had it been in unison with mine." She then confessed she had always liked me, that I might have known it. And in short, I was obliged to say it, then we had mutually misunderstood each other. I, said she, must have seen the singularity of my manner and style of writing, and that I was over head and ears in love. But how could I presume to think that a person like her would care for me? This brings me to 2 points. The first being that this relationship of correspondence allows Anne to fantasize and romanticize what a life with Sabella might be like. And it seems to me, at least from journal entries, particularly after Scotland and into the autumn of 1828, that romanticisation was just that. That life with Sabella would not be as it was imagined. The second point is that it's particularly important to view Anne's relationships in the context of one another. You simply cannot have the understanding you need by viewing each alone in isolation. Anne's relationship with Mariana is influenced by her relationships with other women, similarly to how Anne's relationships with other women are all influenced by her commitment to Mariana. Anne departed from the Isle of Mull on August 1st with hopes of seeing Sabella in Paris. Unfortunately, on account of Sabella's gradually failing health and Anne's desire for her to consult with John St. John Long, a quack doctor in London, the Paris plan would never materialise. Sabella entered the care of Mr. Long in October 1828 and remained in his care until shortly before her death in November 1830. Sabella's health had been poor since the early 1820s, and she was diagnosed by Dr. Steph Belcombe, in 1823 with scrofulous consumption, which we might understand today as consumption or tuberculosis affecting the lymphatic system. It is noted on several occasions that Sabella is suffering from sores, abscesses, severe coughs, and colds. In fact, she was so unwell in 1821-22 that Miss Marsh thought her in a going state. Mr. Long specialised in the treatment of consumption, claiming that he had found a cure. He had no medical training and was an artist before turning to the treatment of disease and opening a clinic on London's Harley Street. Anne first recommended Mr. Long to Sabella in August 1828, after hearing about him from Miss Hudson, friend of Mrs. Priestley. At first, Sabella states she does not need a doctor, but eventually relents, stating, "Your wish is granted, I am under Mr. Long's care. If I am restored to health, it is to your request and information I shall owe it." Mr. Long's treatments included inhaling and rubbing the skin of the chest and back with a corrosive substance so as to promote the expulsion of matter that he believed to be the cause of disease within the body, in this case, consumption. Anne visited Mr. Long's secretive practice in March 1829, writing about what it was that she saw and smelt. She rubbed quarter hour, and I partly did it for her, on her chest and left side just under the breast, with a small piece of sponge. A sort of cream that was in a saucer. It smelt strong of turpentine and had just the sort of drying effect upon the hand that turpentine or other such spirit would have had. On rubbing the chest, a great degree of redness was produced, and at last there seemed buds starting as if from several pinpricks. And from one old place of discharge there issued a trickle of blackish gory blood. And this was the signal to stop, and a cabbage leaf was applied to keep the place to keep it open. The recipe to this corrosive substance was mentioned here by Anne, was purchased on Mr. Long's death in 1834 by a Dr. Kinchela, who used the substance on his own patients, writing about his findings. That book can be found online at the Wellcome collection. The substance was later tested and found to contain vinegar, egg yolk, and turpentine. It was also suggested that it contained quicklime, calcium oxide, to cause that irritation to the skin. The repeated rubbing would eventually cause a large wound where the matter could be released from the body, and it is these large wounds that contributed to the deaths of two of his patients, Miss Catherine Cashin and Mrs. Colin Campbell Lloyd. He is pictured on the previous slide on trial at the Old Bailey, where he stood on 2 charges of manslaughter. On the first charge, he was fined £250, which he paid on the spot. That might not seem like that much money today, considering what the charge was, but back then it was a lot of money, but to Mr. Long, probably also not that much. He had a yearly income somewhere around £13,000, with lords and MPs on his patient list. Following this, his practice was said to have increased in popularity. He was acquitted on the second charge, for which his influence and social status likely played a large part. It was reported at the time he was accompanied in the dock by several elegantly dressed ladies. Mr. Long practiced in a time before medical regulation and of powerlessness of doctors in a world with no antibiotics or vaccinations. Mr. Long died in 1834, supposedly of consumption, having suffered a period of ill health and refusing his own methods of treatment, which is really encouraging from your physician. He could, however, have simply died falling from his horse. A monument was paid for in part by some of his former patients with a complimentary inscription. Anne and Sabella's relationship suffered following their meeting in London before Anne's departure to Paris with Via Hobart in tow. However, she continued to wait for Sabella to join her in France. At the time, Sabella was living on a mere £50 a year, plus the interest received on £500 of capital. This was a worry for Sabella, whose acquaintance Mary Berry, not from Bake Off, I doubt this one was making many cakes, of a famous London literary salon, reckoned £2,000 a year was the minimum needed to live in London to be able to entertain guests and high society. Sabella eventually became too unwell to travel to Paris, and Anne writes in her journal before leaving for the Pyrenees with Lady de Rothsay, "Well, all things draw to an end here, and there is almost an end to earthly friendship with Sabella. Romantic dream, farewell, my dearest Sabella. I shall perhaps remain yet a little while to remember and enjoy the good you have done me, and then perhaps the same mysterious mansion shall contain us both." Sabella died at Grove End, St John's Wood, London on 16th of November 1830, aged 46. Grove End is also where Elizabeth Sutherland, Anne Walker's sister, spent some time, she herself suffering from consumption. Lady Stuart, the first day she called, said, "You have got into paradise." And with these words ends what was thus unexpectedly the last letter my poor dear friend would ever send to me. She is now no more. She is gone. It seems to me like a fearful dream. She slept soundly, viz. Letter page 1, for a couple of hours, a thing she had not done for many days or nights. She then roused and asked Jessie for some gruel, but when she tried to taste it, her head fell back on Jessie's shoulder. Then there was a struggle for about 10 minutes and all was over. Sabella's death was especially painful for Anne, who reflects on this in her journal. "She is the first friend I have ever lost. I know not quite what is my feeling, but it is one of great heaviness and heart-sinking, though I know that her release was a mercy and what all must have desired." It appears to the reader that Anne regretted not seeing Sabella in her final months. She initially stated it was not safe for her to do so, but she later reflects, saying had she known Sabella had wanted to see her so badly, then she would have gone. Sabella was buried at St Marylebone Church in London on 23rd of November 1830, but it doesn't end there. She was exhumed from the crypt at St Marylebone in 1980 alongside 850 others who'd been buried there in the 19th century, and reburied at Surrey's Brookwood Cemetery, where the plot is marked with a memorial cross. This is how her coffin plate ended up in the typography collection at Reading University, and that can be viewed in Sabella's profile over at Packed with Potential. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. So if there are any questions, I will get to those now. So, question from Jane Kendall. I've transcribed some pages which Anne refers to the Quaker, and Anne seems to be warning Sabella against him. Do we know who this guy was and how he wound up corresponding with Sabella? No, it's quite vague who the Quaker was. In fact, my favourite letter it's actually a draft letter from Anne to Sabella in which she's replying to a story Sib told her about the Quaker having a pair of giant scissors, but we've got no idea where he came from. We don't know if it was a romantic connection or a friendly connection, or if there was anything more to it than that. I believe they may have met on a boat at some point, that being in an 1826 letter, the one containing the silhouette. But yeah, we don't really know where he came from or where he went. So that is a mystery, and one I'm quite eager to find out about, because Sabella was definitely not naive. She very much knew, she knew what her friends were doing with their male partners, and she also knew that she knew what Anne wanted. She knew that Anne wanted to have sex with her. So yeah. How do we know the correct spellings? It's a good question. I tend to go with what people use themselves. I think it's important to refer to people how they would refer to themselves, a bit like, Catherine is spelled in many ways, but I spell it like I spell it, and that's how I want other people to spell it, I guess. Yeah, so. But yeah, it's quite tricky to know exactly how people spell names, and particularly with Breadalbane. I'm not sure quite how it was pronounced to her, or if Anne just wasn't quite sure on Scottish accent, because I'm pretty sure in an early passage she calls it something like Broadlebone or Broadlebin, which I find quite funny. What else?
So Kat,
yes.
So you've seen the letters that Sabella herself signed, and she signed with the 2 B's?
See, I think this is the other thing, because we never see Sabella use her own name in full. She calls herself Sib, so the quote at the beginning, "Your friend Sib," is from a letter from Sabella. But I've kind of been going with what her family have been using, because we've definitely had examples of Breadalbane using the 2 B's, and via using the 2 B's, and I said her coffin plate also has 2 B's, and I suspect that was obviously spelled out by someone in her family, but I've never seen Sabella refer to herself in that way. I think she must have done, because early in their relationship they were having a bit of a debate over letter, because Anne was like, can I call you Sabella? And Sabella's a bit like, I'm too old for any other name but Miss McLean, and I don't know if she spelled it out then. But
Right.
yeah, I've never seen her write her own name.
The A in Breadalbane, have you seen that like written out in Breadalbane?
I have. That's in census records. We're quite lucky because Breadalbane lived quite so long, although actually there are seemingly very few records for Breadalbane. But yes, she lived long enough to be included on several censuses, and that's spelt with the bread, like a loaf of bread. So
thank you. Interesting.
That's okay. What else? We have a few more minutes, so. Oh, I get the impression that Anne talks about Sabella, that she was rather gullible and easily taken in by imposters such as Mr. Long. Maybe a little bit, but also I think particularly with Mr. Long, I have the feeling, just based on kind of reading also other letters and other notes by people in his care, that he was perhaps particularly coercive, but maybe in that kind of charming way that some men seem to be able to do. But I think she was quite willing to stand up for herself. I mean, Mr. Long asked her to move in with him and she said no. Similarly, he asked if he could pay for her treatment, and again she said no. But I think it's almost, there's a quote that she says, and it's, if I were not so happy at home, my thoughts would not wander so incessantly to you, about Anne. So I think perhaps maybe she was a little bit eager to maybe find that connection, to be able to leave home, I think. So maybe that made her a little bit more, you know, I will talk to these people, maybe they'll be friends with me. Because she seemed to really want to live with Anne. I think Anne eventually, because she was so tied up with Marianne, I think she maybe got a little bit bored and perhaps a little bit turned off. There's quite a lot of competition between, that Sib says, there's competition between Mr. Long and Anne in those later years, calling him her greatest rival. And I think by that point she was just bored, and she was very much seeing her as a mistress more than a wife or a partner. Ooh, from Caroline Gondet. There's a letter from October 1825 in Muriel Green's book where Anne is trying to get Sabella to come and spend the winter, or part of the winter, at Shibden. Yes, there is. There's the correspondence from Anne during that time, but I'm now trying to remember if what I have is mostly from Anne's journal, pulling out extracts, or if it is actually letters. I have them all on a giant spreadsheet, but yeah, I will investigate and I might get back to you on that one. And Chantal, do we know about Sib and Mariana's connection, how often they were around each other, or if they ever hung out in social circles? Sib and Mariana knew each other through their connections in York, but I don't think they knew each other particularly well. I think Mariana will be able to look at Sib and say, this is Sib, I've met Sib, this is Sib. But I don't think they were particularly friendly. The first record of the McLeans in York is actually the end of 1819, so they weren't in York very long before Anne met Sib. They were there for, I think, to sign documents for Marian's marriage to George Lloyd, I think, if that's correct. It's in this giant book somewhere. But so I think they kind of knew of each other, but I'm also not convinced that they were maybe friendly or not. I'm not sure. In 1820, actually, when Sabella is waiting for Anne in London, Anne tries to convince Sib to go to Lawton Hall to stay with Mariana. And I think Sib, at that point, she was very aware of Anne's connection with Mariana, but also knew what she wanted with Anne. And she kind of respectfully declines, a bit like, oh no, that would be really, really awkward for me. I'm not doing that. No, thank you. And when they do actually meet and they spend a little bit of time together in London in 1829, Mariana's down there in London trying to get medical attention from Dr. Brodie. And they meet as a little bit awkward, and Mariana later tells Anne that she thinks Sib looks about 60, which, considering Sib was very unwell, is probably accurate, but it's still a little bit rude, isn't it? Not great. Oh, have you any plans to visit Coll and Mull to follow in Anne and Sabella's footsteps? I would like to do that. That's on plans for next year, I think. Yeah. It would be really interesting, because I've been before, but to have kind of that past information would be really, it would make it far more interesting, I think.
And that seems to be bringing us to the end of questions. So thank you all for joining. If you have any questions, please contact me, Twitter, Instagram, email that was on the previous slide, but that's great. Thank you.